Good morning, good morning, USA, good morning, Mexico and Latin America. Good afternoon, Africa. Good afternoon, Johannesburg in South Africa. Well, we are going to have our first key speaker. In this colloquium, we have María Paula Meneses. She's going to give us a talk about Africa in the world and the world in Africa. María Paula Meneses is the principal researcher at the Center for Social Studies at Coimbra University. She was assistant professor at Eduardo Mondlane University in Mozambique. She has a master in history from St. Petersburg State University, former Soviet Union, and a PhD in anthropology at Rutgers University, USA. Her research fields are recent colonial history, legal pluralism, and the colonial liberation wars with a focus on Southern Africa, and her work has explored the intersection of history, politics, and culture. María Paula, bienvenida. We are very happy that you are here with us. María Paula, I give you the floor. Your microphone, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour, bonsoir, bon dia, boa tarde, abari, mzuri. So I'm trying to, as much as possible, to activate the various languages we use in the continent to address. Buenas tardes, buenas noches. So let me start initially to say how much I'm pleased to be part of this timely colloquium, and indeed very grateful for the invitation and the possibility to engage in a stimulating and mutually enriching dialogue that I'm sure this colloquium will be. And I think this keynote lecture are a major route for renewing our academic commitments to understanding of humanity, as the people that spoke before me underscored. And in this colloquium, whose key subjects are migration, security, and inequalities, I see the presentation that I will share with you as a contribution to a broader debate on the interconnectedness of Africa with the world, beyond the overshadowing presence of colonial representations about the continent. First of all, I am from Mozambique, so we are part of Southern Africa. And my standpoint position is usually from that region of the world, trying to understand Mozambique as part of Southern Africa, and of a broader world that unites us all. And this is important as from the point of view of recent history of critical thinking, I think we have to underscore two key events. On the one hand, and I think this addresses one of the questions that was brought up before, the so-called global north is no longer the geopolitical center of gravity of the world, and we have to understand this part. And it came with progressing force of decolonization, seen as a broad movement with continuous migratory movements of peoples and ideas. And in Europe, where I currently work, a key question has to deal with representation of Europe in the world, recognizing that indeed what we call a global world is composed of multiple epistemic provinces with multiple epistemological grammars expressing distinct social experiences. And this is our claim of Africa in the world. And I have to share with you that by my own trajectory that was just presented by Alicia, that with my academic training taking place both in the former Soviet Union and in the US, it became clear that the educational projects proposed by this country shared similarities that enable us Africans to enter the academy in our own right, with knowledges and experiences that were not just data, but knowledge thought and produced from other perspectives that did not fit the modern rational models. In short, we could move, we could travel, we travel north, but our ideas and knowledge remain hostages to colonial perspectives. in both contexts, together with various African colleagues, we experienced various episodes of cognitive injustice. For example, the imperial version of linear time that insistently represents us, subject of the South, as underdeveloped, a sophisticated word for immature, living in territories where concepts such as revolution, social and cognitive justice supposedly do not apply. In order to overcome this abyssal thinking that still dominates our academic environments, an epistemological shift is necessary, as we have been discussing over the last decades, in order to recover the idea that there are alternatives to the various crises, and the COVID crisis is one of them, but not the only one. And we have various crises associated with epidemic diseases in Africa. And it's important to recognize the barriers of potential alternative knowledges and ways of knowing. Therefore, I choose to focus my presentation in three key questions. First, that knowledge count, trying to discuss what knowledge counts as core canonic knowledge, and with it, how to move this North-centric monocultural approach to knowledge, addressing possible paths to provincialize the supposed universal narratives towards the world in history as Paulão Tuji, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Gayatri Spivak, Dipesh Chakrabarti have been claiming, and finally the repercussion of revolutionary changes in Southern Africa as a contribution to the liberation of the world. And here an immediate clarification is needed. The South I'm talking about, it's not geographical, it's an epistemic South. It reflects everything that has escaped and still escapes, resists and defies domination or destruction by any monocultural approach to understanding that seeks to exercise knowledge as an hegemonic exercise. And especially I will be focusing on modern rationality. And this is important to discuss through the colonial and capitalist enduring legacies upon African continent, but not just a characteristic of the African continent. So let's start with the idea of what is universalizing. Scholars such as Michel Raff-Trouillot or Suleiman Bachir Diagne have highlighted, evidence against a universally shared notion of knowledge would indicate that epistemology in the epistemology of the North is not simply an exercise in the way the global North talks about knowledge, and not an initiative in discovering the foundation or coherent methods for having justified true beliefs. This reflection is about the very notion of what universal knowledge is. And here one has to be very careful in distinguishing between universal and universality. Along this line, Suleiman Bachir Diagne mobilizes a distinction between two types of universals that are present in the way we theorize in social sciences: a verticalized universal, polarized, and a lateral universal, off-center, horizontal, that defines another way of understanding interconnection among knowledges. If the first, the verticalized universal, defines an apprehension of particularity from a position of centrality that aims never to be contested, the second approach is conceived as a journey, as a migration between persons and communities, a migration of ideas without absolute points of reference from which they are judged and evaluated. And I think this is the approach one should follow beyond any attempt to nationalize or privatize knowledge. Athens, Paris, Baghdad, Fez, Timbuktu, Cairo are all areas of philosophical reasoning where universities of multiple reference are connected, drawing together intellectual plural traditions. In these movements of debate, transference and translation were never and are not linear. They are intertwined, they cross seas and continents, complicating the roles and implications of the academy. And the great colonial division that still impinges upon us between the humanity of the logos and the anthropos fits this distinction between the imperial language of civilization, modern science, and indigenous language that expressed incommensurability of ways of knowing. The challenge to think from the global South calls for the recognition of plurality of epistemological aspiration. It is therefore, as I underscored before, an epistemological rather than a geographical South, consisting of multiple epistemologies that are produced when and where useful experiences are generated in different cultural, historical, political, and social contexts. Thus, by occupying epistemology, oppressed and silent social groups, those who do not count as humans and whose knowledges are not valid according to the modern North thinking, can claim their humanity by representing the world as their own in their own terms. This epistemic struggle is a struggle to surpass the colonial library as addressed by Valentin Mudimbe. The text in the colonial library is still leading corpus of interpretation on Africa in circulation today, represent a whole body of knowledge aimed at translating and deciphering the African object by the global North as a means to dominate, to control it. This goes in line with the syndrome of discovery, that belief promoted by certain academics outside Africa, that they had discovered everything about Africa, rather quite often than recognizing that much of what they have supposedly discovered has long ago been known to Africans. And we share this syndrome with Latin America. It's nothing typically only of the African continent. From an evolutionist perspective, the modern globalized world is the world that the North created, and that thought to impose at the most advanced form of institutions, including some of its last products, the idea of the nation state and the modern university, and associated with it, the idea of science seen as dominant form of knowing a true knowledge about the world. And associated also came the imposition of imperial languages, a single conception of time, space, property, nature, you name it. Worse came the syndrome of abolition, as if abolition of slavery or of any degrading human condition presented initially as a discovery not made by the sufferers or the oppressed, but by the degraders, moved by the remorse or something morally less decent, as Jacques de Pelchin has underlined. Thus, by extension, the anti-colonialism of the metropolitan Africanists embodies this abolitionist syndrome, since it was belated discovery of an intense exploitative immorality long condemned by the colonized. Again, through this approach, the global North continuously reinscribes itself at the center without exposing the correlation of exploitation and domination, without explaining the intimate, very intimate connection between capitalism and colonialism. The invention of the North as exceptional center, and when I'm talking about the North, I'm usually talking about the North Atlantic region, brought with it the emergence of peripheries. And thus the construction of the periphery has to be seen as a political, epistemological, and ontological exercise aiming at generating an explicit definition of the geopolitical and epistemological space where the North is the center. The North Atlantic is the center of knowledge production about supposedly the world. In the African continent, seen from this very particular perspective, the North Atlantic, has in recent centuries been the symbol of the periphery of the world, because underdeveloped and backward on the path of civilizing progress, whose reference were a product of the European modernity. I have nothing against this attempt of the Enlightenment in developing an interpretive framework of the world. My problem is when, based on this premise, modern scientific rationality insists on imposing an abyssal fracture that divides the worlds between the global North and the local South, spaces whose knowledge supposedly only have local traditional value, again synonymous with backwardness and underdevelopment. Yesterday's UNDP report for 2020, entitled The Next Frontier, Human Developed and Anthropocene, omits references to development from a perspective where nature and societies are linked, being the case of Ubuntu, Sumakazai, or Swadeshi. These are sophisticated conceptualizations for whom reciprocity, relationality, and the profound respect of the differences and an emphasis on the complementarities among human beings and between human beings and nature, conceptualizations that are these are very profound conceptualizations that an international institution such as the UNDP seems to be incapable to understand. And worse than that, to understand that these conceptions represent the vast majority of the world. This report, in my view, illustrates how the epistemic colonial project continues to function nowadays. Here, in following Peter Zeke's approach, I address colonialism as a power structure that subverts, destroys, reinvents, appropriates, and replaces anything it deems an obstacle to the agenda of colonial capitalist domination and exploitation. In short, an epistemic and ontological project that creates loud silences in history, or more accurately, perpetuates the oppression rather than liberating people and historical truth. In line with Boaventura de Sousa Santos' proposal for the epistemology of the South, if the epistemological diversity of the world is to be accounted for, and it has to be accounted for, other theoretical frames of reference must be established, anchored in other epistemologies, so that a truly democratic dialogue among equivalent contexts can take place, accounting adequately for the realities of the global South. This inter-knowledge, produced in the contact zones across cultures, is fundamental for a concerted dialogue based upon interpolitical and intercultural translations, giving space for the voices of people and not just the institutional position that usually speak the voice of the North. In an increasingly interconnected world, where Africa is just one of the various epistemological provinces, it is fundamental to explore the contributions of African historical past, the recent past, including its recent socialist and revolutionary utopias, and its impact upon global politics and society. In a world claiming for deep decolonizations, as Françoise Verger reminds us, it's fundamental to move beyond the condition of externality, where colonial subjects are still writing out of the colonial and contemporary moment. Current protests across the world under the banner of Black Lives Matter demonstrate the lasting effects of the omission from historical accounts of the voices and the bodies of those who were most affected by colonialism, slavery, and the enduring legacy of those events of world historical significance, including the political emancipation from colonialism. The global South, heir to the Third World, remain a vast field of experience in the struggle for a better world, a world that respects dignity and humanity in its diversity, but still, today, the global South in its diversity is not assumed as a source of theorization and explanations of events of global impact. We, Africans, have migrated since long ago, but what about our experiences? Where is Africa in world history? There are two types of Africa. The first is that broad place, not a country, where people and cultures live and experience and our experiences. This life is experiencing the legacies of long historical processes. However, these images are not normally overshadowed by the representation of Africa that has been invented through colonial power and knowledge. Universities, research centers, museums, all educational institutions are places where citizenship and belonging are experienced and play a role in reproducing this second image of Africa, the imperial representation of the continent. This is why to decolonize means to conduct committed research, and in parallel demands politically to do away with existing colonial research practice and learning processes, knowledges that bear the legacies of European context and colonial rule in Africa. And not just in Africa, in the global South. I'm not suggesting that we need to do away with these books. No, we need to expose the fake news present in these books, the lies and half-truths these books entails. Lies, silences, secrets, and half-truths are integral to and part of multiple truths, and not somehow separated or distinct from them. Over the last decades, few of the myriad calls for decolonizing the university, the curricula, the mind, and so on, have given little attention to self-definition, collective and individual, as a condition for a deeper decolonization. This is part of a global trend aiming at addressing previous neglected themes and regions to include the voices of those represented as the other in its construction of modernity. Therefore, revisiting the violent impact of modern colonialism on the African continent, putting the accent in the decolonizing project, is a key, in my view, to challenging the colonial liberal desire to re-articulate the modern empire by underlying its ethical goals, as several scholars are attempting. See, for example, the debates on the ethics of the colonial projects in the UK, or the critical debates on the Islamo-Gauchism in France, just to give you a couple of examples. Decolonizing requires grappling with our roots and our belongings to a global world, learning to speak beyond the colonial project as an act of collective healing, and what it means to live, think, and be, and to do research. It asks us to reimagine ourselves in relation, evoking within us the connection to ourselves, our ancestors, our lands, our bodies, and others, so that the knowledge that is inherent and deep within us may be circulated. It asks to epistemological deep listening and to co-learn from other contexts, recreating a web of knowledges that has been what characterizes us as humanity. It calls to reclaim knowledges that have been silenced, exiled, erased, denied, shamed, or neglected, or even negated. History cannot be ignored when we consider the being which defines who we are, and yet which cannot determine the becoming with which we shape ourselves. And now I'm entering the final point of my talk. When accounts of the past are dominated by the voices of the global north, the violence of colonialism endures as a cognitive and at the cognitive and political levels. Southern Africa experiences of collective struggle for a radical rupture with colonial and racial discriminatory relations are often missing from cosmopolitan debates. Since the early 20th century, however, the cry for African liberation has combined a theory, a political and moral struggle aimed at contributing to a whole new perspective on humanity that moves away from that political legacy of subhumanity generated by slavery and modern colonial capitalist project. The struggles for self-determination are at the core of political projects that brought about deep political transformations in Africa since the second half of the 20th century and open up new horizons of liberation. The liberation actions, the result of awareness of the communities, of the oppressed groups, translated the pedagogic character of these revolutionary transformations, as the processes were imbued in the conscience of those groups as a path to something to be transformed with intentionality. Yet, the epistemological value and effect of these political transitions beyond independence has yet to be fully apprehended. Decolonization, following a narrow approach that has been predominantly used, is mostly interpreted as a transition to independence granted by the former empires. However, Africans were used to engage with the world, both academically and politically, in order to craft theoretical weapons to be used to gain our emancipation. In the 50s and 60s, African revolutionary and academics understood that the dominant concepts, theories, and analysis of African reality were inadequate to produce a post-abyssal way of thinking or to provide meaningful guidance for systemic transformation beyond colonialism, as masterly treated by Walter Rodney. Yet still, very little analysis exists on the revolutionary path in Africa, a situation that's not a characteristic of the continent. The Haitian, Mexican, or Cuban revolutions are also seen of regional value and importance. But are not these revolutions part of a broader liberation ethos that a narrow Eurocentric approach cannot or is not willing to grasp? The ideals of Pan-Africanism and Third World cosmopolitanism are important products of liberation and of thinking that germinate in intellectual and cultural roots across the global South. In this reading, cosmopolitanism evokes a broad political and cultural zone of contact that emerged from vernacular indigenous roots and is compatible with the best tradition of anti-colonial revolutionary socialist project, being such examples, and I'm just going to name a few, of Senda Senghor, Julius Nyerere, Eduardo Mondlane, or Kwame Nkrumah. The cosmopolitan thought that lay at the core of African socialist project was produced in dialogue with other contexts and had impacts beyond Africa. These projects also became vehicles for social, cultural, and political transformation elsewhere, from Latin America to Asia and Europe. Seeing from this perspective, the coup d'etat that led to the revolutionary return to democracy in Portugal in 25th of April 1974, is the byproduct of the liberation struggles fought in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. Nonetheless, and despite the relevance of the continent's history to activists and revolutionaries across the world, Southern Africa remains largely terra incognita in scholarship relating to revolutionary transformations. And the limits of mainstream scholarship become particularly evident as the predominant focus on socialist revolutionary projects is placed again upon Europe, and we are offered at majority of the universities a simplistic understanding of the political transitions towards independence and decolonization, which often reproduces the politicized understanding of liberation struggles. African socialist projects have deep roots. Nkrumah's rebellious cries, colonial and suppressed people of the world, unite, reverberated in 1945 Pan-African Congress and voiced the struggle of Africans for the right to dignity, to self-affirmation, and for the recognition of African political subjectivities. The countries that gained political emancipation after World War II sought to articulate the idea of an alternative political project to overcome the divisions of the Cold War. A political principle common to various versions of African socialism combined the traditional socio-cultural features of equality, cooperation, and humanism that characterize in broad terms the pre-colonial African communal village life with wealth and potential for organization that modern production methods and state institutions could jointly afford. This approach was a response to the humanizing and exploitative situation imposed by colonialism. The claim for political autonomy, the decolonization of the mind through education, and the valorization of African cultural heritage were foundational elements for the anti-colonial struggles. In short, socialism implied a militant position against the linear path of development that was implemented by colonial administration and that continued with neocolonial independences as stressed by Eduardo Mondlane, or still under internal colonization as theorized by Samir Amin, Pablo Casanova, Rudolf Stavenhagen, or Harold Wolpe. As in Latin America, the goal was to liberate Africans by means of the possibility of thinking from their own heads and imagining other possible futures. When Mozambique and Angola obtained independence from Portugal in 1975, they did so after long and bloody armed struggles. Their political emancipation was fundamental to the final liberation of Southern Africa, supporting the struggle against Southern Rhodesia, colonized Southwest Africa, and apartheid South Africa. These countries shared a common vision of breaching with colonial capitalist and segregational regimes, and their history is one of radical political imaginaries developed throughout the liberation struggle in alliance with other progressive forces across the world. The power of revolutions spans over a short but dense period, resulting in profound changes that contribute to radically change the political landscapes of the region and the world. It's important at first to reflect on the emergence of the new subject with new political proposals. The difficulty in understanding these changes arises, in my opinion, quite often from an analytical stance that insists on focusing on the prescriptive revolutionary project of the North as its analytical epicenter. What is a revolution if not a dramatic rupture? Since the early 1960s, Africa has known epistemic and ontological emergencies beyond the color line in the cognitive degradation. Currently, all over the continent, national languages are used, regional history learned, indigenous leaders rule the continent. In Southern Africa, being that the case of Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, the key nationalist movements wager on a radical democratic proposal where the people should choose their leaders, participate in the country's governance, and take part in the discussion of the country's affairs. This revolutionary option mirrors a radical revolutionary will for change in several dimensions. But above all, and going back to Frantz Fanon, it's the power of the damnés, of the colonized, to decide from their heads their options for their future as agents of their history. Not only independent, which is the element that normally emerges in the analysis, but independence has the right to write its history, to assume the struggle as a right to self-determination, as self-definition, which includes a struggle for cognitive and social justice, for land, for education, for health, for emancipation of women, for the right of young people to speak. That's why we keep saying the struggle continues, because many of these objectives were still not achieved. In short, a broad sense of radical political, economic, and epistemic revolution. This was and still remains a utopian space of challenge that reintroduced by new political subjects and other forms of experience in being in the world. This is the project that happened, and it happened in Southern Africa. And we should not forget the reception and the support of these movements, of these processes to other liberation struggles across the world. For example, the support given to Black Panthers in Tanzania, where some of them came to visit Mozambique Liberation Front liberated areas and experienced the influence of their political actions that some of them which were brought back to the USA. As underscored by one of my interviewees for this research that I'm carrying out, Tanzania was seen as a revolutionary Mecca, visited by Che Guevara, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, C.R. James, Angela Davis, Giovanni Arrighi, Aldrich Cleaver, Peter O'Neill, Walter Rainey, just to name a few. In this context, later to be expanded to Maputo and Luanda, no one was immune to as someone told me, liberation revolutionary virus. So sometimes there are good viruses. Returning to this question, to the Africa in the world and the world in Africa, it's perhaps clearer how discourses of modernity claim world historicity, but still presenting a truncated version of North Atlantic history are still dominant in our academia. That's why it's so important to shift history, to change radically the core of the production of narratives about ourselves, recognizing the plurality of possible interpretation and selection, not as a description of events and processes, but as an opportunity for reconsidering what we had previously thought we had known. By engaging with different voices, we are forced to move beyond simple dualisms to make a difference to what was initially thought, not so that we come to think the same, but that we think differently from how we had previously thought before our engagements. This anti-colonial revolutionary project aimed at rehabilitation of a degraded humanity, at cultural reparations, renewal of the world and of humanity. It was fundamentally a question of uttering new words, of intervening in the discourse of the purposes of human existence through other economic strategies, other cultural experiences, of opening up other human potentials, of making a world with the others. In our times, and I'm already finalizing my couple of sentences, decolonization is no longer limited to anti-colonial struggles, as it entails the demise of dominant approaches to the history of Global South to include broader responses to decolonization. And this process, the study of decolonization, involves the awareness that the Black identity requires radicalism as a profound instrument of preserving Blackness and navigating its world, even in an environment when there is cultural cum radical pluralism. It brings back the urgency for countries of the global north to decolonize their history and to recognize the multiple African political agencies with sophisticated institutions, with cosmopolitan connections beyond the legacy of modern colonial library. An interconnect net of histories, to borrow from Sanjeev Subramanian, will enable us to understand the world as made of various provinces with specific time epochs, with wider processes in parallel. It exposes the exacerbation of historical, apologetic, and patronizing views of the impact of colonialism on Africa, as the return of crude right-wing politics for whom monocultural administration, neoliberal economic policies are the basis for progress and for civilization. Borrowing from Felwine Sarr, I think it's important to draw on the past, both real and imagined, to create and regenerate in permanence a liberate version of the future which is planted in the African experience. It's about African utopias, historical writing, and it's about these moments of radical transformations when worlds once familiar cease to exist and other potential worlds are being created. The future are us. It's our responsibility to think of a planet of peace, of respect with the nature, with people, beyond this abyssal thinking that insists in situating Africa on the other side of history to be rescued by the North. These ideas were central of the 1980s Independent Commission, chaired by Willy Brandt, that reviewed international development issues. And here let's remember Amilcar Cabral when he incited us, hide nothing from our people, tell no lies, mask no difficulties, mistake, failures, claim no easy victory. This challenge was taken seriously by the South Commission, headed by Nyerere, that opposed Willy Brandt's report by claiming more South-South cooperation. And I see this colloquium as another piece in the wall of this bid. Let's change the gaze and vigorously contribute to think our continent as an active part of the world, a world without borders of thinking, but rather a world of exchange of people, ideas, and projects. And if in line with Achille Mbembe's suggestion, if we want to conclude the work of decolonization, we have to bring down colonial boundaries in our continent and turn Africa into a vast space of circulation for itself, for its descendants, and for everyone who wants to tie his or her fate with our continent, a space of utopian liberation, of struggles for cognitive and social justice, a space of cooperation and co-learning. And I'm sure this is the goal of this colloquium, with which I stand in solidarity, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Paula. You have given a lot of ideas, but one of the things that I think it is very important is the decolonize and the deconstruction of the colonial knowledge of Africa, and also for the colonies. And another thing, when you talk about Samir Amin, Pablo González Casanova, we are very close in our thought between Latin America and Africa. No, the thought that dependence and the structuralists during the 60s and 70s, it was, I think, a new knowledge to abord the problems in our continent, in the global South. But you said, let's change. And then I think this colloquium is new ideas to change, especially the African knowledge. I would like to know if we have some questions. Here, I'm going to read ones that are in the chat. Me, yeah, Jose Cosa, yes, to bringing up Ubuntu as a sophisticated, nuanced understanding of the human. There is still a misunderstanding of Ubuntu that leads to an appropriation deriving from the constant attempt of modernist sense of interpretative privilege. This is something we Africans must still watch for. Then a questions of Dean Franz Fanon, inspire African liberation movements and their leaders such as Madiba, Walter Sisulu, and Amilcar Cabral? It's a question. Then Eric Schmidt, thanks, Paulina. Just to confirm, Alicia, you are able to view questions. Yes, I am reading. And then, well, if there are more questions, and I don't know if in the channels, in the social nets, if there are some questions, and I don't know here in the panel, who are in the panels would like to raise their hands to give just one questions because to continue the deliberation.
Thank you so much for the very interesting and challenging questions that put my mind to think, and I'm trying to put it in a broader perspective. I have a problem with the idea of the new and the modern, because the new, taking Ubuntu as a reference, it's based upon the roots. And this is a problem with this colonial interpretation of our realities. We are always forced to cut with the past, because the past is always not just another country, but another reality. So this idea of roots from where we think to create new or innovative ways has to be seen in perspective. So this tension between what exists and what we aim to get. And this is very interesting in the African continent. And some of the approach that I see quite often in other contexts, it had been experienced in the continent. For instance, the problem, as I mentioned briefly, the use of national languages. In various African continents, we have various languages. So I think I don't know any African, well, my knowledge of Africa, I know probably like a third, mostly urban context, but I have traveled a lot, and I never met anyone who would just speak one language. People usually speak 3 or 4 because people travel a lot, we move a lot. And in order to move, we need languages. So language is a form of thinking, is a form of transmitting knowledge. And it has been appropriated by the governments, reintroducing language as a form of self-affirmation. So we have in various countries and contexts the use of bilingual education, which has been a very interesting exercise to understand the tensions between the national project, the sovereign nation state, and the conditionality, local conditionality. So this has been one of the interesting attempts. A second one has to deal in the context of Southern Africa, for instance, the experience with popular courts or community courts where there is the use of the constitutional rules that form the country and the local, regional judicial systems that are also part of the system of attempting to solve of conflict mediation present in our countries. So it's a form of rethinking the judiciary system, not just as an export from Europe, but also something that is a symbiosis of the realities present in the context. So these are 2 or 3 small examples just to show of what is being done there, but we have to be tuned to understand these perspectives from the context where they are happening, and it's not very easy given the diversity of context. Obviously, there are also lots of problems, because if Ubuntu would be a philosophical principle that would bind us all together, obviously wars would not be present, and we are now a continent ravaged by war. And I don't want to talk about my own country, where we are now facing a radical Islamic insurgency in the north that has already resulted in more than 40,000 people, internal refugees, and lots of children not going to school. This in the context of COVID. So it's a tricky question. So this is the problems that we have. But I agree with the idea of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is not, it's not just I am because you are. This was the political use of Ubuntu for specific purpose that one has to understand, the truth commissions in South Africa. But Ubuntu is deeper, as Ramos usually talks to us about, saying that it's my relation with people, with the broader world of the ancestors, of the spiritual world, and with nature. Because many of us, when we live in our context, we all belong to an IMU, to a structure where there is always a natural element to which we are related to. So if my name is a crocodile, for instance, I'm not supposed to eat crocodiles, and I'm supposed to protect crocodiles because crocodiles are part of my family. So these are structures that were developed to preserve the environment and to show clearly that this separation between nature and society, it's an imposition from another epistemic context, from another province of the world. So I think I explained a bit what Ubuntu is about. And finally, this question about Fanon. I don't think Fanon was influenced a lot of revolutionary leaders. Fanon was part of the group of Présence Africaine in Paris, where very interesting and very important questions, reflections were taking place. Lots of, I think one of the last ones that passed away was Marcelino Santos recently from Mozambique. I think there are 2 or 3 still alive from that group, but it was a group of refugees, of intellectuals from the global south, especially from the then Portuguese and French colonial world, that would gather together to discuss possibilities, to think from beyond. And Frantz Fanon was part of it. I think the two of the, now I'm trying to clarify my point. I think Fanon, coming from Martinique, he was trying to explain, sometimes even for himself, what he was witnessing in Algeria during the colonial period and the reasons of the liberation struggle. And quite often he would translate, and sometimes I see it, the work of Amilcar Cabral and Frantz Fanon, a work of translation of the contingencies and conditions of the struggle to left Marxist groups that sometimes were not understanding what was happening in the African context. And I'm trying not to misquote Amilcar Cabral, but both Amilcar Cabral and Eduardo Mondlane have reflections, something like, because he would be quite often interpelled by journalists, so are you Marxist, are you socialist? And they would say, yeah, we are. If you think that to be socialist is to struggle for social and cognitive justice, to struggle to be able to think and to rule ourselves, then we are socialists. So it's this tension between what we are and this quite difficult task of translating the complexity of the South, of this then third world, to this narrow monocultural environment of the North that is quite often present in these works of these leaders like Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Eduardo Mondlane. And that's how I see, and that I think we have to revisit their work because it's very enlightening about these tensions inside the empire.
Okay, let me see.
And I forgot to add one question. I took Alicia's challenge very seriously, and I tried to create a theoretical structure for this presentation using essentially authors, male and female, that have been engaged mostly with the global South. So the question was, can we think from the South? Yes, we can. The problem is that quite often we have to translate ourselves through the global North. And this was the big exercise of this, or organizing this presentation. Can we think and theorize from the South? Yes, we can. It's not easy, but we can. So Alicia, thank you very much for the challenge. I hope I was up to the task. I'm not very sure I achieved the goal, but I attempted. At least I attempted.
Thank you, Maria Paula. Yes, I like a lot your your lecture because we have to change. We have to change how we learn when we the Western how we have learned the history through our when we were since we were little in the primary and then in the school, and how the knowledge. So that's why it is very difficult to deconstruct this deconstruction of thought and to see from another view. And I was, when I was seeing the UNTAD report, just to prepare a little words for the inauguration, I was very impressed of the trafficking of capital flows from Africa to the big corporations. And this we must regulate. And also right now with the COVID-19, the vaccination, how vaccination doesn't progress, even it doesn't progress in Europe. How can we think that what will be the hope to vaccinate African countries? And as just in a talk a few days ago, Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize, said that we won't finish, we won't recuperate until vaccination, everybody is vaccinated. But the other thing is that with this crisis, with how COVID shows us the inequalities that we have already known and we have already lived, if it is going to be a real change after this? Do you think, Maria Paula, and then we will finish this conversation because we have already our next session. But do you think that we are going to have? Do we have a hope after this COVID? After this, the pandemic is going to finish. Maybe we will have another pandemics in the health sector, in the financial sector, in the economic, of course, we are having. But do you think it will change, and especially in Africa, when they are having now a lot of interchange, a new commerce agreement, a new trade agreement? What do you think about it?
Africa, we are rather diverse. I think one of the few things that unites the countries is the fact that most of our governments are liberal. I would say 99.9%. So that is a challenge that we have. It's the ruling structure of the continent, but that is one of the perspectives. Getting initially to the question that the flow of capitals, it's a big problem, it's a big risk, and it's how I see the perverse nature, and that's why I was looking at the UNDP report yesterday, which are the big questions of cooperation, of the definition of inequalities in the world, and no one is talking about the trafficking of influences and the tax evasions and so on in these countries. I have a lot of colleagues who studied with me, which are lawyers, and they are basically specialists, as I call them. You are very good thieves because you are taught how to steal the state and steal the people. And these are conditions that are happening, and are happening with some of them with support of very good friends, our friends from the north, being it China, Gulf countries, countries from northern part of Europe. It's happening. So these are deep problematic issues. But for instance, one of the interesting questions in the African context is that in several, I would say almost half of the continent, the land still belongs to the state. So the owner of the land is the state, that figure. So there is no private property of the land. And private property, which is a big difference between sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, is that property is capitalism. Ownership is belonging to the project. It's the Ubuntu project. I belong to that. Avakatem, I belong to the Tembe, to the region, to the river, to the context. It's not I own the river, no. I belong to that part. The problem is that when we enter the discussion, assuming that property is ownership, which are two different concepts, which are really problematic. And I think one of the tasks that the governments are attempting is to control land as belonging to the state and leasing it in different moments to big companies, but still not private property. Obviously, there is a strong pressure by the World Bank, by IMF and other bilateral and international institutions, either because they don't understand, either because they are not interested in understanding which are the contexts in which we work. Now, quickly about the vaccines. The first thing I wanted to call the attention is that one of the first experiences about vaccination in the 17th century, reported formally to the Royal Academy of Science or Academy of the UK, is about a variolation taking place by an enslaved person in the US that was reported by his owner to the Academy in the UK. Meaning that there are lots of knowledge in the African context that was exported to the US, now it's US, and then exported to the UK as a practice. So I'm talking about variolation, not vaccination, but the procedure, the thinking of the procedure is that. So we have contributed, and you are contributing to the world. The CDCs in Ghana, in Gabon, in Senegal, I think, in Nigeria, in the various other countries, in South Africa, they were part of the decodification of the genome of SARS-CoV-2. So if there is something interesting about this virus, is it put all the academics together to think how to solve the problem. And there were researchers from Latin America, from Africa, and from Asia. And what we see, that's why I was talking about capitalism, the appropriation of the resources by these big companies of the North, now saying, no, we are the companies, we develop the vaccine, but the vaccine is a process. It's communal knowledge. So I'm totally in disagreement with this neoliberal approach by the European Union regarding the patents on vaccines. In my country, I have to say the thing is not that bad. We have already vaccinated, I don't know, 45. I was checking the data yesterday, 45,000 people. It's again the new Cold War. So vaccines are being offered by India, by Russia, and by China. Now AstraZeneca is arriving. So we have to see the struggles between the new and old imperial forces trying to interfere through vaccines and to gain power. But the vaccination is going on. It was delayed a bit, but it started. My problem is I was checking the data. We are still under 1,000, officially 1,000 deaths in Mozambique. But the problem is that we already have this year more than 1,000 deaths by malaria and by other diseases, by like cholera and so on. So by focusing on a problem that suddenly became the problem of the world, we are forgetting about our diseases that are also killing our people. And I have a grandson that was born a month ago, and I was discussing with my daughter, they are in Maputo, about vaccines and so on, about the nightmare to go to a health center to register, to give the vaccines to a newborn because of all this problem around COVID. So it is challenging the life of people because suddenly everything is about COVID. But above all, what I see, which is rather interesting, and I'm glad to see there are more people from Mozambique, like Jose Costa and so on. What I see is that people are used in good and bad sense to face diseases. So when people say, well, you are supposed to follow these procedures, people trust more or less the government, and they more or less follow the rules because we had cholera outbreaks, we have this, we have that. So there are no this liberal reaction that I see quite often, this, I would say, almost irresponsible reaction in certain contexts of the global north where people say we want freedom. And freedom is individual freedom, where we are not responsible towards our citizens because this is the Ubuntu principle. I exist because we are. And if we are, I have to be responsible for everybody, not just about me. So I think we have, for the future, we have to rethink the tension between duties and rights, between the individual and the collective. This is my big lesson now. And I think from the South, there are a lot of lessons about our co-responsibility, our humanness towards one another, and not just thinking about myself or about the others. And I hope I answered your question.
Maria Paula, thank you very much. We are just on time, but Jose Luis Gasquez is going to say only one sentence for you, and then we will pass to the first panel. Jose Luis, please.
Good morning. I'm very delighted with your presentation, and I think everybody is as well. And I would like to thank you for putting the epistemological issue at the center of your talk, because that is what it brings us together in this event. No, we are a Mexican university that we make part of the global South, and I think we have a lot of common points, a common history. And our common history is colonialism, even though that we overcome colonialism a long time ago. We still need to find some other epistemological frameworks and ways of thinking in this context. So I want to thank you very much for your interesting lecture and your very provocative insights. Thank you very much, Dr. Maria Paula.
Thank you, Maria Paula. Thank you, Jose Luis. And then we go to our next panel, who will